Unwrapping is the part that most people try to avoid. Personally, I find unwrapping very therapeutic and I really like it, so I hope that after knowing a few basics, you will like it too, or at least you won't run away from it. There are only a few things you really need to remember about, the rest is just a little bit of patience and practice. At the beginning, some vocabulary. I will say word seam a lot as we need to find a way to cut our UVs, and we're doing that by applying seams. They are not cutting the object, but only tell Blender where the UV should be cut. We'll be also using the term UV island, and it is a chunk of the model that was unwrapped and projected to 2D space. We will also keep the material view with the UV grid texture all the time to better see our UVs changing. Let's start with the hammer's head, so I will isolate it by pressing / and go to the edit mode. For this tutorial, we'll focus on placing seams and unwrapping simple objects, but the process is the same for all models. So, in general, you need to think about UVs like they were 2D representations of your model, so you can wrap a foil around it and then unpack it. To make it look the best, it would be nice to use as few seams as possible, but sometimes we can't avoid putting a bit more. We can place seams by selecting edges you want to put a seam on, pressing Ctrl E, and selecting Mark Seam. On the hammer's head, we need to cut somewhere on the back, because the general rule is to place seams in the places that are not visible, or in the back of the object. Sometimes we can't hide them, of course, just like here. We need to put some seams to the sides of the hammer's head. Clothes and the seams between the sleeves and the body part are a good example. You can't really avoid them, they will be visible. Placing seams is crucial for painting nice textures later, so it's better to try to make the UVs clean. Let's select the whole hammer head and press U and unwrap. We can see in the UV editor that everything that was selected in the viewport was unwrapped. Before that, we saw only some weird faces, and now everything looks nice and 2D. Let's go out of the isolation view and select the cloth. Now we'll repeat unwrapping of every object. I like to use the isolation mode as I can focus only on the part that I'm unwrapping. Where to place the seam? It's a good question, and you will know the answer with practice. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how to do this for all the cases because it depends on the model. After this lesson, I will share a few tips for creating nice UVs, but for now, let's select one seam as we wanted to cut this piece of fabric and we need to cut it vertically like we wanted to unfold it. It doesn't have faces inside, so this one seam on both pieces of fabric is enough. After we're done, we can select everything and press U and unwrap. It looks okay, no distortions whatsoever. The last part will be the handle. We can see that this object is closed at the bottom, so probably we'll need to place one horizontal seam to make the bottom the separate element and one long vertical seam to let the shape be cut to lay flat. So, placing seams, unwrapping, and that's it. For simple objects, unwrapping is very easy. Depending on the shape of your object, sometimes you want to change the method of unwrapping. This option is available after pressing U in this little window at the bottom of the viewport or UV editor. Its location depends on where you place your cursor while unwrapping. Angle-based method is used mostly for organic models that have irregular shapes, and conformal works a little bit better with hard surface models or just the models that have a lot of flat faces. You can use them both for different parts of the model, so let's select two vertices from the hammer's head sides and press Ctrl L. And from the options window, select seams and then press U and unwrap, and select the other option, conformal. Depending on the model, you can see bigger or smaller changes, but in general, we want to go with straight and not distorted UVs. So next time when you'll be unwrapping something, select the method that works the best for you. Sometimes our model is symmetrical and we want to have exactly the same textures on both sides, no matter if we will texture it in Blender, procedurally, or by hand, or in the other software. Here we have the same model and we can definitely say that it is symmetrical. Usually, when modeling symmetrical stuff, we use a mirror modifier so we can unwrap only half of our model. But if the modifier is accepted and we didn't make any changes to any of the sides, we will still have an edge going right through a symmetry axis and we can use it to mark our seams. So let's do it now. In our case, the head and the handle are symmetrical, so we'll unwrap them only. After placing this one seam on both parts of the model and unwrapping, we see that the texture is stretched, so we need to add more seams again, remembering that they should also be mirrored. This time we don't need to cut the whole loop around the sides of the hammer's head or the handle's bottom, because we already have one big seam going right through the middle and cutting in more would result in too many UV islands. I am selecting the shortest path between the vertices by clicking on one of them and then pressing Ctrl and clicking the other one. So let's place a few more seams. And unwrap. Now we see that all the islands are separated, so what we have to do is to select one of the pair. I'm usually keeping the UV sync selection with face select on, as it is easier to see what I am selecting in the viewport. So let's click somewhere on the half of the hammer head and press Ctrl L. We should have the whole island selected and now we just need to mirror it. The gizmo shows us the X and Y axis, so for this one, we'll use X. We can use Ctrl M and then select the X axis. Now it looks identical to the other one and we need to move it to cover the second half by using G and then Ctrl to snap one island to the other. Sometimes we manually move the islands so they're no more in the perfect grid and we might have to use the vertex snapping. A little circle will appear when we press Ctrl and we can snap it. Let's do the same for the hammer's handle. Remember that the mirror axis depends on the seam placement. Sometimes we want to mirror something horizontally, so in this situation we would probably mirror these elements by the y-axis. In the process of unwrapping, we are rescaling the islands often and then we see on the viewport on the right that the texture doesn't have the same scale everywhere. That happens also when we are unwrapping one part of the model at a time, because Blender wants to scale all the islands to fit as much to the UV space as possible, so the bigger parts of the object will have less dense texture than the smaller ones. To solve that, we need to select all the UVs, and from the UV drop-down, select Average Island Scale. This is also a good moment to check if our object has the scale applied. If not, then some weird things might happen and the average island scale might not work properly. Our object has the scale applied, so let's select the average island scale option and all of our islands have the same textile density, which means that the size of the texture is the same everywhere. Sometimes we want to have a little bit more detail on some parts of our model, so we can scale it up, and it's also okay unless someone specified that it's not allowed. For this case, we can make them the same size. Very important thing while talking about UVs is how much area they occupy within the UV space. Fortunately, we don't need to place all of the islands by hand because it might take a long time, especially with big, complicated meshes. Blender has a built-in packing algorithm, which is not perfect, but it works okay. Let's see the UVs of our hammer. In the UV editor under UV, we have the option of packing the UVs. We will select all parts of the hammer and let's select this option. And a window appeared with some options. In most of the cases, the only thing we want to change is the margin. If you want to keep rotation and scale of your UVs, you can uncheck these options, but remember that if your UVs are too big for fitting the UV space, they will go outside the UV area and we don't want this. For this case, we want to keep the rotation, so we will uncheck this option, and we need to select Merge Overlapping because we place them on top of another and we don't want them to be separated again. If you will leave the Scale option checked, Blender will automatically resize the islands to occupy as much space as possible, and the UVs won't exceed the UV area bounds. The margin is the amount of space between the islands. It is necessary to put some space between them because we don't want the textures to bleed from one island to the other. In Blender, when setting the optimal margin size between UV islands, we don't type the margin size in pixels. Instead, we divide the recommended amount of pixels between UV islands by the texture size, which consistently results in a value of 0.007. So the optimal distance between islands is actually 0. James Bond. Maybe it will be easier to remember this way. And our UVs are packed. Another thing you should remember about is UV's orientation. So while texturing in the different program, we want all the parts that are, for example, made from wood to have the same orientation of wood grains and texture. It's not necessary, but it speeds up work. For painting textures in Blender, we don't have to do that because we are not putting any directional textures, and even if you're using some stencils, we can rotate the brush. We can save the rotation of the islands by leaving the rotation option checked off while packing, so they will retain their rotation. Another important thing is that if you export your low and high poly models to software like Substance Painter, you need to place seams on hard edges and mark them as sharp. Thanks to that, the software will know that it has to isolate both faces being connected by the hard edges, and the transition will look just like in the high poly model. With organic models, so for models that don't have any hard edges but the mesh flow is very smooth, placing seams is a little bit tricky. There is no rule on how to do it, maybe just trying to minimize the amount of seams and placing them somewhere when you can't see them. It doesn't really matter where you will texture them because you can hide the seams anyways, but with just a few islands instead of hundreds, it will be definitely way easier. Now, when you know the basics of unwrapping, let's see the most common problems with UVs.